Final Fantasy XIV is a game utterly packed with difficult group content to test you and your friends' mettle to the very limits. 19-minute gauntlets requiring utter perfection in ultimates, savage criterion dungeons where if you make a single mistake from the 20+ minute runtime, start to finish, you wipe and need to go back from the beginning again, and huge 48 player raids where in order to even attempt them, you need to meticulously prepare for dozens of hours, leveling and obtaining consumables and getting a like-minded, capable group together. But there aren't just challenges for groups in this game. Despite being an MMO, some of the most crushing, daunting achievements are those for beating group content, but completely on your own. Enter Palace of the Dead, Heaven on High in Eureka Orthos. These randomly generated dungeons are truly devilish, packed with enemies that have one-shot mechanics with no telegraphs whatsoever. Completely invisible traps which can blow away your progress in a second, and its own in-house leveling system, meaning that every time you enter, you're building back up from square one. And it's not just one dungeon you have to get through either. Before you get to take a break and catch your breath, you need to pass an entire segment of 10 floors, with the exit of each floor set being guarded by a dangerous boss. Each floor requires a number of mob kills to open the portal to the next floor too, so you can't just sneak your way past. Why would you need a checkpoint, you might ask? Well, it's because each deep dungeon has at the very least 100 floors. The earlier floors are relatively relaxed and can be queued with random players, but as you make it through to the greater numbers, it's reserved for pre-made groups, marking it as a true endgame activity. Deep dungeons are generally intended to be taken on with a party of 3 other players to back you up, allowing you to make up for one another's mistakes. When somebody dies, you pick them back up. When an enemy attacks, the tank will take it, being the shield that protects the group. When an enrage casts, the DPS will begin their burst, deleting the monsters in a moment. But solo, you don't have access to any of that. All you have is your own skill and awareness, and if you slip for a moment, it's over. Back to floor 1. Why would you put yourself through this in the first place, I hear you ask? Well, I would tell you that I love a challenge and it sounds like a bunch of fun, but I would be lying. There's a much, much better reason to fight against the odds. The titles are pretty good. Lone hero, once and future queen, and standing above them all, the necromancer. To own even one of these titles is considered a triumph, a sign that you kept your cool under pressure and emerged victorious. But on and off, I've been on a quest to obtain all 3. Lone hero fell first, and I made a video about the experience of conquering Heaven on High's 100 floors and making it to the top at long last. Next came once and future queen, obtained from besting the 100 floor depths of Eureka Orthos, and I streamed all that. And now, I was going to take on the greatest challenge of all, the deep dungeon to end deep dungeons, one that dwarfs even the other 2, Palace of the Dead. To get the Necromancer from Palace, you need to make your way through 200 floors of progressively increasing difficulty, fighting trash mobs that can nuke a DPS in just a few auto attacks, and facing up versus some of the hardest bosses Deep Dungeon has to offer full stop, including one fearsome foe that is considered the greatest battle of all, with entire strategies and sets of timings dedicated to felling it on each and every job, because you need to deal with it in a different way based on the nuances of the class you choose. A single run can take upwards of 15 hours. 15 hours of precise, painstaking safety aiming. After release, it took around 1.5 years for the very first Necromancer to be crowned. And now, I'm going to try and become the newest. But before you can even attempt it, you need to go through multiple layers of prep to have a real shot of taking home the win. I mentioned that each deep dungeon has its own leveling system, but it also has its own gearing system. You need to collect these Aether Pool buffs from chests and floor set completions, which are almost entirely obtained at random, and they cap at plus 99 on the weapon and plus 99 on the armor. And grinding them out, it takes hours. On top of that, special sustaining potions exist, which can be popped on a 30-second cooldown to give you a powerful regeneration effect. And to obtain them, you need to trade in pot shards, which, you guessed it, drop randomly from chests within the dungeon itself. Luckily, a few quick 5-hour runs of Palace of the Dead as a group is enough to cap out and collect the potsherds I needed. The other most important thing to figure out is which job I wanted to commit to going for my clear on. Out of the 19 options, there were 3 clear standouts to choose between. Red Mage, with equally potent damage and healing capabilities. A classic top pick for Deep Dungeon because it brings the 2 most important traits into Deep Dungeon, survivability and kill speed, in one neat little package. It was the most popular Palace of the Dead solo job for years for a reason. Machinist, offering the highest sustained damage at the cost of safety. Yeah, you can nuke everything, but you need to utilise good kiting and potion timings to keep yourself alive in the later floors. Machinist was high risk, high reward. Lastly, Warrior. Thanks to raw intuition, the job had unparalleled healing capabilities, but because it was a tank, your damage was on the low end. You're trading the ability to take on the even harder mobs for being in a race against time to get to the 10th floor in the set before the instance timer runs dry. In Heaven on High, I chose Warrior. In Eureka Orthos, I took Machinist. And now, in Palace of the Dead, I decided to bring out the axe once more. After months on end of promising I'd give it a try, and even one failed attempt that went terribly wrong when I came up against the real FF14 superboss, the 90k error. I had finally committed, queued up, and locked in. The opening floors ease you in gently. The most complicated mechanic you're going to deal with is a small AoE to dodge, or an auto attack to take. But you still need to take your time and be careful, because there's something in these early floors you need to obtain as they're going to be essential to victory later down the road. Pomanders. These provide buffs that will make or break my attempt. Some are straightforward, like straight damage or defense ups. Others can reduce the number of enemies on an upcoming floor, give you a 50-50 chance of getting a room full of easy, instant kill Corrigans, or something altogether more menacing, or even transform you into a monster capable of killing every enemy in a single hit for a limited period of time. You can have up to 3 of each individual variety of Pomander at any given time, and there are 16. Collecting a full stash of Poms was my goal, in preparation for the inevitable difficulty spike later down the road. So I got to work. I don't remember this fight, like, at all. Oh, it has fucking telegraphs, okay. That's the in? Yo, thank you very much. Damn, they did the out, then the in? That's wild. Well, that wasn't too bad. There was basically nothing in the first 100 floors that proved much of a threat, and they went down quickly. If anything, I was a little taken aback by how chill they'd been. The first 9 floors would take 15 minutes or so to power through, then you'd fight a boss for a couple of minutes that didn't really do much of anything. It was a far cry from some of the speedy gauntlets that the likes of Eureka Orthos put you through. Within a few hours, I was passing the halfway point of my first attempt, and things were looking great. But the second half of Palace of the Dead is where things change. From this point onwards, a failed mechanic can often just flat out one-shot you, throwing you all the way back to floor 1, and where, increasingly, each trash mob encounter becomes something to carefully plan around, and in some cases they can be so dangerous that you need to avoid them entirely. Luckily we weren't deep in Fear City quite yet, as 101 through to 170 went fairly smoothly. Before I knew it, and by before I knew it, I mean at the low cost of almost 10 hours of my real-time life, I'd completed floor 170. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this whole Palace of the Deadlark seemed, well, kind of easy, but the worst was absolutely yet to come. From now on, I would need to pass the greatest challenges that Deep Dungeon has. 186 to 189. 3 dreaded floors which I've often heard quoted as being the reason that you stockpile all those Pomanders, because you're going to be using them liberally to even get through. The final 3 floor sets as a whole, or as a warrior, it can take me like a minute to slay one single enemy, leading to the clock becoming as great a challenge as staying alive on the floors themselves. And the greatest battle of all, the Behemoth. I needed to go in with a plan. Because time was of the essence, I decided that my best course of action was to open floor 171 with aggression, liberally burning Pomanders to help me surge through quickly, and using fortunes to increase my chest drop rate to recoup the losses. And by I decided, I mean that's the advice I read from the guys who had done this 1,000 times, and to me it sounded pretty smart. So here's the full plan. We go in and immediately pop our very limited auto-race pomander for the sake of progression. Then we use sight to forcibly reveal the locations for all of the traps on the floor, meaning that we can then move around relatively freely without issue. Now floor 171 to 173 has a higher spawn rate for bomb traps, a type that you usually want to avoid at all costs, because stepping in one of these deletes 80% of your max HP. And if you take one while not quite fully topped or in an encounter, it's just going to eliminate you entirely. But we could use this to our advantage, because landmine traps also affect enemy mobs. So using Warrior's defensive cooldowns and survivability as a tank, we're going to locate a landmine trap, grab as many mobs as possible, being careful to avoid those with dangerous mechanics. We bait them all over to the landmine, and we go down together. Using Holmgang we survive easily, and comboing it with Raw Intuition will heal us back to full, and then we can easily and quickly kill an entire floor's worth of enemies, all at once. And as if nothing goes wrong, and god, there's a lot that can go wrong. 171 begins, and I start strong, searching for my landmine trap, picking up the easiest mobs I can find with Tomahawk as I go. And then disaster struck. Despite there being a higher spawn chance for them, there was not a single landmine on my entire floor, and like an idiot I had already picked up 4 mobs and kited them around for the last 30 seconds. The only options I had was to die or to burn a defensive steel and 2 of my witchings to turn them into chickens and kappas and finish them off while they were helpless. This wasn't the ideal start. I trudged to 172, began chest hunting hoping to recuperate my early losses, but instead of rewards, I kept running into mimics, eating into my precious time. Mimics weren't awful by any means, they deal a lot of damage and have enough HP that they take a while to kill, but the real issue was it meant that I wasn't working on clearing a safe passageway to the exit. And in the cases where they didn't drop a fresh chest on defeat, it hampered my chances of building my Pomander collection back up. At these endgame sections, most floors also came with inhibiting debuffs to make things even worse, and on 173 I got Gloom, strengthening enemy attacks against me, meaning that even on Warrior I had to be very, very careful and plan my mitigation well to avoid death. My Mimic streak continued too, and I watched my time slowly whittle away, knowing that I'd have to use more of my precious stash to catch back up. Then, while fighting my millionth Mimic in 2 floors, I gained a friend. Wait, no, 2 friends. These wolves were monsters I had been warned about. Their attacks apply a massive dot, which can be dangerous at the best of times, but here on a Gloom floor, and with 2 of them, alongside a Mimic that was almost a death sentence. If I wasn't on tank, I would be dead in seconds. As tank though, I held on, barely surviving, rotating my cooldowns and burning my self heals, praying for a break. But it wasn't enough. Dead. My auto raise went off, and I ran away from that last damn wolf with my tail between my legs. My attempts to save time had amounted to nothing. My chest luck had been awful, and now I had a weakness to my name. The next handful of floors went mostly without event, and on floor 175 we got introduced to the boys! Big monkeys which beat their chest outside of combat, giving you a vuln up if you're caught in their range, and Anzus which stun you for heavy damage on repeat, and need you to play extremely safe while fighting. I always had my eye out for both of these mobs, and I managed to avoid any more unfortunate incidents. Before long, I was passing through to 180. The boss of floor 180 is the Behemoth, the wall for Palace of the Dead solo runs. The majority of this boss encounter is fairly relaxed, with you needing to place and then avoid Charybdis tornadoes, leaving yourself enough space to dodge huge cleave attacks that follow, all while healing through the high-hitting autos. On tank this is especially simple, and it honestly doesn't pose much of a threat. But when Behemoth hits 16%, he begins his enrage sequence, and the game changes. He summons meteors back to back, chunking almost your entire HP bar off in every single hit, and he keeps doing it, either until you die or he dies. This part of the fight is so tough that every job has a completely individual recommended rotation and setup to deal with it, and should you press even one button wrong, it's likely going to cost you the run. For Warrior, that setup relies on you building full gauge early, having as much time as possible on your Storm's Eye damage buff going into the enrage sequence, and applying 5 stacks of Vuln to Behemoth using the Succubus Pomander, as well as a strength to up your damage. Then, you wait for the perfect moment, exactly as Behemoth is locked into an extended caster animation to mount your attack. This lets you chip away at his HP as much as possible before the enrage sequence even begins, and as it does, you'll rotate your healing cooldowns, sustaining potion, a healing potion, and your invuln, all to barely survive a handful of attacks, and then you hope that your damage is enough to take him down before he takes you down. That was the plan, at least. The first section of the boss went perfectly for me, with well-placed Charybdis, good mitigations, and solid uptime. Without too much problem, I was facing down the enrage, and at 22% I began my setup. The strength was popped, my gauge was mostly full, and I transformed into a succubus to apply the vaults, avoiding mechanics as I did, and at 16% I sheathed my axe and waited for my moment. There it was, the fell cleaves came out, and before the first ecliptic meteor hit, the boss had already lost 7% of his HP. Raw intuition, thrill of battle and my sustaining potion were used as planned, but to me it didn't look like enough. I'd messed up. The boss keeps auto-attacking during this final onslaught, and I had totally forgotten. I didn't have enough HP left to survive the next hit. It was going to be over. I was going back to floor 1. So I panic popped Equilibrium to save my life. The pull kept going, but now I'd lost a heal that I had planned and needed for later. Build more gauge, fell cleave, hit hard, hit fast. Holmgang was next, this was no problem. But now I had nothing left afterwards because of my earlier mistake. It wasn't going to be enough. The run was over. 1%. The cast was done. It's going off, me or him. Somehow I'd done it. My luck had turned. My last auto attack on the boss, for 729 damage, was the difference maker. Next came 181 to 190, arguably the toughest 10 floors that Palace of the Dead has to offer. The plan was to burn my pomanders liberally to make it through the early floors with time to spare, just like before, because I needed roughly 12 minutes when I made it to the boss in order to beat him in time. That is assuming that I managed to beat him in one try, because even with raising, if I died I would not have enough time left to finish the fight. I needed to get ahead early, and then I would use my most powerful pomander, Rage, to sweep through as much of 187 to 189 as possible. These 3 floors are the most deadly that any deep dungeon has to offer, with tons of patrolling chimeras which aggro by sheer proximity, casting their speedy one-shot untelegraphed AoEs. Pulling more than one at a time would be the absolute worst case scenario, and considering that I'd used all my witchings by this point, I couldn't do anything about it if it happened. All the way up to 185, things seemed to be going pretty well. I didn't have the nightmarish start that I had in the last set, and my pomanders were being utilised to great effectiveness, cutting a sway through everything that had the misfortune of running into me. Time wasn't looking fantastic, with me entering 185 with 37 minutes left on the timer of my initial total of 60, but I was banking on making back the deficit from speedy rage floors a little later down the line. Here, at this point, single pulls were king, and it was important, especially as a tank, to ensure that I was chain pulling almost constantly. Because time wasn't on my side, if I wasn't always hitting something and always keeping Berserk on cooldown, I was wasting my resources, making my own life harder. Carefully selecting these targets had been really effective, and here I was picking up these free Vinthurs and avoiding the much more dangerous, sound-baited crawlers. This worked brilliantly, until having picked up a Vinthur safely from this crowded, dangerous room, I forgot to stealthily walk during my retreat, accidentally grabbing a crawler along the way. Boom. Another auto-revive burned. I was running out. Because Pomander of Raising could not drop at all this deep into Palace of the Dead, every one that I used here was one I'd never get back. I begrudgingly popped another, leaving just one remaining, and continued onwards. At 187, it happened again. While fighting one of those dreaded chimeras with the HP debuff floor effect active, making it way more dangerous, my concentration lapsed for a second. I'd been in the Deep Dungeon Blender for over 6 hours on that day by that point, and while it's kind of understandable that my mind would slip to other things at least once or twice, it couldn't have come at a worse time. As I looked away to check the positioning of a currently non-aggressive, patrolling chimera in the distance, the ram's voice cast begun, and I hesitated, unable to get out of the way in time. Boom. Auto raise gone. I decided to save my final one on the hope, or maybe cope, that I'd make it to floor 191, meaning that for the rest of this set, I couldn't afford another mistake. But it wasn't too bad, because 2 rages later, I made it through to floor 190 with just enough time to complete the boss. The 190 boss is called the Godfather. He's certainly not as infamous as Behemoth, but absolutely deadly on its own right. This boss, aside from heavy auto attacks and massive avoidable sap AoEs, will spawn his little bomb buddies. But some of these little bomb buddies have a lot more to them than just an exploding AoE. In sequence, a remedy bomb will spawn, then a little later, a lava bomb. Remedy bombs cast an enrage, and they need to be quickly dispatched in order to avoid their scary instant death cast. But with lava bombs, the boss will instead begin casting an enrage of its own, and you need to quickly knock the lava bomb into him before it explodes, so that the AoE from the lava bomb's explosion hits the Godfather, stunning him and resetting his enrage sequence. Well, you could do that, or you could do what I did instead. Because the large bomb spawn locations are not random, instead following a fixed static rotation, I just brought up a handy little picture showing where all the lava bombs would spawn on my second screen and pre-positioned the boss for each one, meaning that when the moment came, I just had to stand and let things resolve. Because this was a very long fight, I'd be aiming to burn my Lust Pomanders just like in Behemoth, but this time I'd be keeping 5 stacks on the boss for as long as possible and shortening the whole endeavour exponentially. And finally, with 5 minutes left on my timer, he went down. I had made it to the final 10 floors of Palace of the Dead on my first attempt. Pomanders were looking alright too. If I played my cards right, didn't make too many mistakes and kept my cool, this was winnable. The final 10 floors were all about effectively using whatever resources you had left. Floor debuffs here were worse than ever, with a detrimental effect present on pretty much every new stage. Mobs are tanky as hell, requiring a solid minute of encounter time apiece as a warrior, more with damage reducing debuffs present. A failed mechanic would still instantly kill me, but the timer loomed once more as the greatest risk to my clear. Luckily, there are a lot of undead enemies on these final 10 floors, meaning I can use the last transformation pomander available to me, Resolution. Transforming into a Heavenly Karibu, you cast Heavenly Judgment, dealing 1/3 of the undead mob's HP in a single hit. This was how I was going to claw back the slipping time, and I needed to use my 3 attempts really carefully. At 194, I got distracted again, this time making the classic streamer mistake, one I've made before in a Deep Dungeon solo run no less. I looked at chat, and I got hit by an AoE while I did so. Dead. Re-raise activates, and now I've got nothing left. My buffs were gone, my reses were out, and if I made one more mistake throughout the rest of this run, I would have just griefed away a truly promising necromancer attempt. And so I forged on. I pushed, I fought, I delved ever deeper. As I exited floor 198 with a solid 10 minutes left on the timer, I couldn't help but smile. I had saved my secret weapon in reserve this entire time, that last rage. Checking the coast was clear and scouting the exit came first, and then I smashed it. As the key unlocked, I stepped inside and all my collective stress from the last 6+ hours evaporated. Well, almost.
Wouldn't it be really funny if I disconnected, like right now? Yes.
No, I'm just kidding, it was fine. It was more than fine. At the long last, I was the necromancer. I had beaten it in one full-length attempt, despite the various misadventures I'd had along the way. I was super happy. Heaven on High had taken me over 5 tries. Eureka Orthos had taken me 3. And now, as I sat on the victory bench of Palace of the Dead, alone, having cut down the number of attempts to just 1, I thought back on the whole experience. While the lower floors had been dreadfully dull, those final 30 floors on all 3 deep dungeons had been challenging, exhilarating, and more than anything, really fun. I had a great time. I almost wish I could go back and try them again, without needing to go through the monotonous slog that came before it. These pieces of content use an entirely different skill set to those you learn in the rest of FF14, and having to learn new ways to approach problems and think is really interesting, and I found it a very positive experience on the whole. To those thinking of attempting a solo deep dungeon yourself, I really recommend you give it at least a try. You might bounce off finding it uninteresting or the type of challenge that you aren't motivated to overcome, or you might find a new passion. There's a very dedicated community for this content, full of people that spend their time doing it as their main pastime in the game. There are those that have beaten every deep dungeon on every job, those that speedrun it, and they even have their own informal version of a world race. I remember watching Finn Bazal's stream as he raced to become the first player to solo Eureka Orthos on every job, and it was sick to watch. With another deep dungeon confirmed to be in the content pipeline for Dawntrail, likely releasing as per usual with its 0.35 patch, while I'm definitely going to enjoy my break now, I'm looking forward to being in Mortal Fear for way too long than is healthy all over again next expansion. And hopefully, I'll see you there, sporting Necromancer titles of your own. Good luck.